Today is Doctor Who Sunday, and today is the day where we don't address any woke issues that are going on in the world, and we have a little bit of fun and we review some Doctor Who. In this case, we have some classic Doctor Who, and I know this is one that you have all been waiting for weeks now, but it's taken me a little while to put together. Hello and welcome back to Chat About It, Don't Shout About It with me, Rachel, the Queen of the Woke, as crowned by one of my haters. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe to the channel, switch on the notification bells so you know I'm releasing another video. Thank you to everyone who's joined me already. I cannot run this channel without you. We are on the way to 2,000 subscribers officially now. We made 1,500 subscribers the other day. Thank you so much. But can we get to the 2K now? Can we do it? You are all very lucky that you're getting this review today because I promptly soaked my notebook in water by accident and had to dry out the pages with a hairdryer and then put it to air dry. Now, luckily, none of the pages that I wrote on for this particular review were smudged that badly. And ironically, all of the other reviews that I have worked on in between working on this one were all smudged. So I think that's a good sign. Today, we are talking about The Trial of a Time Lord, which was voted by you, the subscriber. To vote on the current poll, please head on over to the post page where you can find it. I release a new poll every Saturday at 10 a.m. I also try to feature subscriber comments in each review that I do, so be sure to keep out an eye for those posts. And I will ask you for your opinion on each story. So I've had a lot of comments for this particular part of The Trial of a Time Lord, and it was very difficult to choose which ones to feature. So The Trial of a Time Lord is a very long story, and in order to make it coherent, I'm going to break it down into its individual stories. Even though it is seen as one, I will acknowledge that before I continue. So we're going to look at the first four parts, which is The Mysterious Planet, in this part of the review. It was written by Robert Holmes, it was directed by Nicholas Mallet, and it aired from the 6th of September 1986 and finished on September 27th, 1986. The average viewing figure was 4.35 million people, which ironically, even though it is one of the better stories, it's the lowest scoring story in The Trial of a Time Lord. Interesting that. I find that very interesting. And it's Robert Holmes. So that's even more interesting that that should happen. The Doctor is being put on trial for his meddling and interfering nature. He is summoned to a space station where he meets the Valeyard and the Inquisitor. The Doctor's memory is fuzzy, but the Valeyard presents evidence from the Matrix that has been recorded as to the Doctor's notorious and meddling nature and the reason why people die around him. The Valeyard suggests that the trial should be a full trial, with the penalty being the termination of the Doctor's life. The Valeyard shows evidence from the planet Ravolox that distinctly reminds Peri of Earth. We see them wandering around the planet. We also see Sabalon Glips and Dibber. These two are planning to destroy the light conversion system. This conversion system has been turned into a totem pole by a tribe. This tribe is ruled by Katrika, who has seen so many people come to try and take down this totem. So therefore she will not allow Glitz and Dibber to do the same, and she throws them in prison. Later, Peri is also thrown into prison with them. This is because the Doctor had gone off on his own investigating and had been taken to meet the robot Drathro. He discovers that he needs to disable the black light system because it's imperative for life and saving the world. The Doctor promises to help repair the system, but he determines that it is beyond repair and says that it has to be shut down. Drathro, of course, does not want this to happen because that would mean his own destruction. The Doctor continuously pleads and begs him to reconsider, but this would prevent the explosion of the entire universe. However, he does not. The Doctor notices that the black light system has, in fact, started its own self-destruction already, so he has to try and stop the chain reaction. He manages to make it so that it only destroys the castle. However, Drathro takes a big hit. What does this mean for the Doctor? Does he save the universe? And he does, naturally, of course. And the remaining inhabitants of Ravolox were able to start a new life on the surface. Please let me know in the comment section below what you think of this story. Naturally, this is a huge story, so I'm going to need some help, and I'm bound to miss something out because, well, it's me. I always do. There are lots of issues with the trial of a Time Lord. I will start saying that firstly. And whilst this is an epic saga, so to speak, it wasn't the wisest of moves because we know that the TV series at the time was facing the chopping block. They had to really impress the controllers here in order to keep it going because the series was on trial. They decided to put the Doctor on an actual trial. And I think this is one of those stories that would have been better off being scrapped and them just doing 4 to 5 individual stories like they had been doing with Colin's first season, which actually was pretty well received despite what people think of Colin's Doctor. But because he had a hiatus in the middle of it, I think his viewing figures really did suffer, and I think also the writing did suffer because it was quite convoluted, this story, in many respects. So it did really suffer, especially because you go backwards and forwards between the courtroom and the main part of the story. John Green 7619 says, I wish I liked it better. Both leads are doing their best and show a great relationship, but the apathy on the production side is all too clear. And I often spent a fair amount of this rewatch wondering how much exactly was playing through onto the screen, or if that was because I knew what was going on behind the scenes. So maybe I felt like I was more hyper aware of it than perhaps what I would have been when I first watched it and I wasn't aware that it had happened. I try my best to always separate these things from the production itself, but it's not always easy to do that. The Mysterious Planet isn't the worst of the bunch, I don't think, in my honest opinion, but it has a lot of issues, and I will cover that a bit later. But let's talk about the good stuff, because it does have its good stuff, you know. I am a big Colin Baker fan, so I cannot go without praising the Sixth Doctor. I think he does a fantastic job. He's got a lot of weight on his shoulders throughout this entire story arc. I know he quite often says, Colin this is, that he doesn't really know what was going on behind the scenes, and that may very well be the case. But there were people who said that he was trying to placate a lot of things that were going on. So imagine doing that, but then also working on your Doctor to the point where you pulled it back, and he clearly went away thinking, what can I do to make my Doctor work? He tried to soften his Doctor. I know that's something that he did always want to do anyway, and he's very much gone and done that now within the Big Finish stories. But he was trying to do it in this story as well. I think he might have needed a lot more direction, but it's very clear that he worked very hard with the director. I think he's trying to give his Doctor more varying colours. He's definitely not so snappy anymore. I think the relationship between his Doctor and Peri has developed. They made it look like they were traveling together for a very long time by this point. And I think that was a good move to do, actually, because obviously we had the hiatus. So there's going to be some passage of time. And, well, Nicola's hair was longer as well. So you had to make it work. I don't know why I said that, but I did. He has his doctor moment in this story. Annoyingly enough, it is in the courtroom. He has a full debate with the Valeyard, but he has a mega outburst, and it is utmost outrage. He had already presented this type of outrage in his first series as the Doctor, so it wasn't anything new, but because he had played the rest of the story throughout varying degrees of colour, when this actually hit in part 4, it was a million times better than what he would have done in the previous series. And I appreciate that he took the time and effort to do this. Not many actors would go away and analyse their work like that. I'm just saying. At least that's what I think. I've seen that happen with other actors. And you could see that he's really thinking about it. I think it's one of his best Doctor Who moments in the TV series. This Doctor is given a lot of action. You can really sense his fractiousness when his franticness, when he tries to prevent a black light explosion. Even a child who may not know exactly what is going on would be very enthralled by what the Doctor is talking about and how he is acting. He's certainly very much a hero in this story. He frees the underground slaves. He's certainly focusing on the urgency when he is talking to Drathro about switching off the black light because of the black light explosion. It's almost fearful. It's very tense, and I'm very dramatic. So I appreciate that. He had some very eloquent discussion with Drathro in this story. I liked the sequence when the Doctor is captured by the robot and tied up. It is pretty well staged as well, actually. You can tell that they had some very good rehearsals for this story. The actors themselves would have loved playing out the court scenes, even though they're very weak. Not the actors, the court scenes, I mean. I also think it was perfectly well within the Doctor's character to go ahead and refuse a court defender. He had the smarts and the intelligence to defend himself, and I like that. I also like the fact that he is no longer the Lord President of Gallifrey. I always imagine that would be something the Doctor would never want to be tied down with. So when it happened, I was like, what? Why? They tried to work in some fun little quirks to his Doctor. I noticed as well, he's randomly carrying a teddy bear. Why is he carrying a teddy bear? And what does he need a teddy bear for? Who knows? But he has one. However, this now does bring me to some downers. One of the biggest things that I do not like about this story is the fact that it keeps cutting back to the trial room, which sounds completely dumb because the series is called The Trial of a Time Lord, but I find that it takes away from the actual context of the story that is going on before the viewer's eyes. I know that he is being tried for interfering with other galactic affairs, but it just really isn't necessary. Just because of what is going on outside, they had to make it representative and put it into the story. Most of the message may have gone over people's heads. However, I think once you know the full story of what's going on, well, it's pretty obvious what the message actually is. This does lead to some of the worst interactions between the Doctor and the Valeyard. It was almost childish. I know they definitely had fun doing that. I'm not going to contest that. They've all said that they had fun doing that, and that is fine. But the writing for it, I don't know what Eric Sherwood was thinking when he wrote these segments to link these stories together to the trial, because it resulted in things like the Doctor calling the Valeyard such things as boatyard, graveyard, knacker's yard, that type of thing. It's not something that I personally would ever associate with the Doctor. I know we get the buffoonery with him from time to time, but people often say that when you resort to calling people names, that's when you've lost the argument. Take that as what you will and what that would mean for the show. I just did not like it. I really didn't like all of the cuts back to the trial room. I know I've said it already, but let me be more specific here because I wasn't specific earlier. It's not a good idea to put the Doctor on trial. It's a good idea for Troughton, but not for this Doctor. This Doctor needed something different. But the issue that I have with the cuts is that it plagues its way through the entire story arc, and it also affects the main story because they stop it at the best parts in some cases. And one of the best bits in this entire part of this part of the story is the Doctor getting hit by stones. I had to phrase that very carefully as well, or I would have been demonetized for no reason at all. Now, it's good that the Immortal stops the Doctor from dying. I like that. I was really enjoying what was happening to the Doctor. I know that sounds a bit morbid and a bit dark, but it cut back to the courtroom. It should have finished on a cliffhanger with the Doctor getting hit by stones, but instead it finishes with the Valeyard saying that it should have the maximum life sentence for the Doctor, which was the termination of the Doctor's life. And then we get a close-up zooming in on Colin's face for the cliffhanger, which happens quite a fair bit throughout the entire story arc. And it's, well, I feel really sorry for Colin, actually. Now, not all the cliffhangers were bad. For example, the cliffhanger in part 2, the Doctor's trapped by the robot and Katrika's army, and the Doctor says, I really think this could be the end. I thought that was a good cliffhanger. It didn't finish in the courtroom either. We also get a very rare moment where the cliffhanger ends on a guest actor. The cliffhanger in part 3 ends on Murdine, and the question is, does he take the Doctor's life? But then our 4th cliffhanger is pretty weak because there's more evidence to come. Determine the Doctor's life. I think a lot of this writing is quite shoddy. You see, I love the Colin Baker Doctor. He's my favourite Doctor, but I can also be extremely critical of his era. I have no choice but to be. I've got to judge it fairly. If I can judge Tom Baker fairly, I need to do the same here. To see the amount of subscribers just walking out the door because I just dissed the Tom Baker Doctor. I'm joking, it's absolutely fine. He's fine as the Doctor, he's just not my favourite. Just another thing to add about the cutaways is that they're probably the equivalent of my dislike for the sonic screwdriver, although the sonic screwdriver is inherently worse. Because other than zooming in and cutting away at the wrong time, they don't really add much to the story until the last parts of it, if that makes sense. Another thing that I have issues with is the Matrix being used in this story. Now, it's only referred to in this story. It's not until the end of the trial of the Time Lord, the last 2 parts, where we entered the Matrix. But the issue that I have with it is because it was introduced in The Deadly Assassin, that means that they can bring it back as a plot device whenever they want because it's an easy tool to use. And I don't always appreciate that type of writing because you have all that weird stuff that happens in The Deadly Assassin and it works with The Deadly Assassin. But the thing is, until the last story, it doesn't really work having it there because what the Valeyard can do is say, well, this happened because it's in the Matrix. But then the Doctor could be like, I don't remember this happening. This is being manipulated. And then the Inquisitor's like, you can't manipulate the Matrix. I just don't find it very creative, particularly in a courtroom setting. Now, let's get back to the positives because I can't ignore this any longer. The opening shot in part 1 is one of the best opening shots in Doctor Who history. You can't deny it. You just can't deny it. Well, you can deny it if you like. I don't mind if you disagree with me. That's absolutely fine. But I personally think it is in this respect. They clearly have sat down and they have thought, right, what can we do to visually help save Doctor Who? Like, a third of the budget would have been spent perhaps on the courtroom, and part of the mysterious planet was filmed on location, so they could probably afford a little bit extra to go that extra mile and do one of the best openings that we have ever seen in classic. It's a shot that they use and in different ways throughout the entire story. It was amazing just getting it beamed in like that. It was so good. It's so clear. For the first time in Doctor Who history, it was so good. That was a fantastic piece of engineering. And I'm not going to say that all the other special effects are terrible, okay, because they were all unique for their time, but this was really upping the game. They were upping the ante. I'm no special effects expert, so I've no idea how it would have been done back then, but it was fabulous. Floydian 2007 says, after the glorious opening sequence of the space station dragging the TARDIS into the beam, it's downhill from there. Very dull story, lots of getting captured, escaping, and then getting caught again. No real threat or particularly scary, just pointless runaround. Good incidental music and relationship between the Doctor and Perry is much better. I don't find this story dull, but I do agree that there's lots of getting captured and escaping and getting caught again, as said in this comment. And I do agree that the relationship between the Doctor and Perry is much improved, and I praise those two performers for working really hard on it. This story is also subject to some other very good special effects, although not as high in quality. I really like the Doctor using the electrocution and how they did all of that around Drathro in order to help his minions escape and things like that. And I like how they blow up the beacon, the transmit beacon, that is. And it was such a great plot device doing that because it made the power unstable, which causes everything else to unfold, and we get that fantastic performance from Colin. There's a lot of little clever plot devices throughout this entire story. How they managed to create the demise of Broken Tooth and Katrika, the type of electrocution and a bunch of lightning and the blood that was pouring down their face, that was extreme. I love that. It's certainly something that I did not expect, for sure. I mean, that's quite horrific, seeing them being struck by lightning, cutting away, and then coming back to their faces just streaming in gory blood. And I just want to say some things about Joan Sims here. Her character reminds me of Joan of Arc or Boudica or Boadicea, however you say it. There's different pronunciations for it. It's very much the type of character that is a strong, independent leader, a warrior. And this makes sense because she's done this for thousands of years. Sorry, she is thousands of years in the future. You must get that right, Rachel. And it's very clear that Joan very much enjoyed the role. You can tell that she did. It's not something that you would ever associate with Joan Sims taking the role like this. Now, obviously, we know in the UK who she is. She was always in the Carry On films. However, I'm not sure if people in the USA know who she is. I don't know if you get the Carry On films over there, but that's what she was really well known for over here. So to see her pop up in Doctor Who was probably quite a treat for everyone because she's quite a funny actress. Well, she was quite a funny actress. So seeing her do a very serious role was brilliant. I also find it interesting that even though it's set thousands of years in the future, so to speak, we find out that it is Earth, but in the wrong position. They did a historical setting for those characters. That's very intriguing. I wondered why they did that. They often seemed at one with a natural UK habitat. I often find myself asking myself, where on earth did they film things like this for Doctor Who? We're quite rich with countryside habitat over here in the UK. Now, what does everyone else think of Drathro? The reason why I ask is because I quite like his design and I love the voiceover performance of the character, but he doesn't really do much. Other than that, I see him as a bit of an anti-villain, if you understand what I mean, because I like the idea that he needs to use the black light in order to survive. But I also like the idea that he doesn't want to turn it off because obviously he wants to live. In order to survive, he obviously turns on the vent, which I thought was great because it was a little scary moment, and we get to see the Doctor acting as a hero as he tries to save all of his friends. And I also think that he's not played with a lot of anger, though in my opinion, compared to a lot of other villains that we get in Doctor Who, I think he's almost understated. I'm not sure if that type of character is suited to Doctor Who or not. I don't know. We get it with other characters, and that suits it. But robot, understated robot, I don't know. I'm not sure about that one. What do you think? Now, I'm going to focus on Peri in the second story of the Trial of the Time Lord because right now I want to focus on Glitz and Dibber. These two are quite fun characters. My question is, would they have made good companions? I personally don't have an answer for that myself. I'm just interested in what you may think. They're your typical street urchin thieves, almost black market types of characters, aren't they? Little do we know that they have a bigger role altogether, especially Glitz. We don't know at this point what it is that was in the black box that Glitz and Dibber wanted. That's only left for viewers to try and work out for themselves until the end of the entire arc. But I love how they made it so the Doctor could save everyone. They gave the Doctor a chance to shut down the computer by doing something that I didn't expect. That was a double cross because of the nature of their characters. Well, it appears to be a double cross because Drathro needs the black light to survive, and they both convinced him that they have the black light, and they double cross him, and then naturally, of course, they make a break for it. Very clever little plot twist there, and I think those characters were extremely well used throughout, and it's very clear these actors enjoyed doing this. It's almost like the better version of Adric, even though I don't mind the character of Adric. Mark NH2HS says, I always had a soft spot for this story. Remember it being aired on TV as a kid, and the Sixth Doctor I loved and still is one of my fave Doctors. I love his sarcasm and condescending responses, especially about the sacred texts. The courtroom parts I never found jarring like others do. Plus you have Sabalon, Glitz and Dibber, two of the best characters. When Glitz returned in Dragonfire, I was so happy to see him again, but often wondered what happened to Dibber. I agree. I was glad when Glitz came back, and I often wondered what happened to Dibber as well. Overall, The Mysterious Planet is an okay story. It's definitely the best of the four, but it's let down by many things, and it is mostly to do with the courtroom. In my opinion, I think putting the Doctor on trial runs the risk of a huge convoluted mess. That was a risk that they clearly were willing to take, because at the end of the day, what else could they lose? The BBC wanted it gone. It had an 18-month hiatus. It was in really bad shape. I don't know if this is true, but when I was doing some research for this story, I read that Eric Saward, his wife, had suggested the trial for the story because the Doctor was on trial in real life. I don't think it's a well executed concept. However, if that is true and he decided to do that, then he took a huge risk taking advice from someone who is, as far as I am aware, not a creative. They could have presented it, as I've said already, in several different stories and then maybe had finished with a trial and made the stories all interlinked in some way to make it towards the end with the trial like they did with the war games. That could have worked. A rehash, but in a very different way. They also decided for some reason that the experiment of 45-minute episodes was a failure. Now, I disagree. I think that the 45-minute parts in a several part story is a very good thing. It gives it more time. Sometimes 25 minutes can feel a bit rushed, although it is obviously spaced out over several different parts. So for the Trial of the Time Lord, they went with 25-minute episodes for the entire story, except for the last one, which was part 14, and they went with 35 minutes, and they kept it at 14 parts, and we would see this for the remainder of the Sylvester McCoy era. Mind Warp was written by Philip Martin. It was directed by Ron Jones. It aired from the 4th of October 1986 to the 25th of October 1986. It aired to 5.08 million people on average. Please be sure to leave a comment below as to what you think of the story Mind Warp. As usual, I am bound to miss something out. The Doctor has been accused of meddling and his life is at stake. The Valeyard presents his next set of evidence in the form of Mind Warp. The Doctor and Peri land on Thoris Beta. Whilst there, they meet a scientist named Crozier who is developing and conducting experiments to prolong life on Keeve, who has a life-threatening condition. He needs a brain transplant of some description in order to save his life because his brain is getting too big for his head. These experiments that are being performed by Crozier are at the risk of other people's lives, in particular the one warlord king, Yucanus. The Doctor and Peri escape with him and they plan to make an attack on Syl. However, the Doctor abandons them, or so it appears, at the last minute to warn the Mentors. This results in the Doctor questioning and interrogating Peri. However, the Doctor does tell her that this was his plan so that he could find out what was going on. In Syl's mind, this does result in Crozier trying to transplant Keeve into another specimen's body. None of this, of course, goes according to plan, and chaos ensues. As Peri is strapped down and prepared for an operation, Crozier is going to transplant Keeve's mind into her head. The Doctor is on his way to save Peri when he is suddenly hypnotically drawn into the TARDIS and taken to the trial. The Doctor is blaming the Time Lords for what has happened to Peri, but the Valeyard argued that it is the Doctor's fault in the first place that we see that Peri has ended up in this situation. We believe that Peri is dead at the hands of the Time Lords after we see this. The King was wildly firing and he ends up causing Peri's demise. The Doctor, he is devastated and he insists that there has to be an ulterior motive. This story has a lot of good points. It also has a lot of bad points. Is it the weakest of the four? I don't think so. I think it's probably the second strongest of the four, the strongest being the first one. Do you think the story is also convoluted? The reason why I ask that is because I remember when I first watched it, I had to watch it a couple of times through to fully understand what was going on. There was a lot of getting captured and running away in this one, and I think there is too much of a backstory, even though I know it's playing into the character of Syl and him wanting the weapons. I just don't think that backstory was needed as much. It offered a lot of padding. All these meetings with the Mentors and all of that, I think were fine, but it's just better to have him lusting after Peri and trying to focus on his Lord Keeve. It is creepy in his demeanour, and trying to ensure that his Master Keeve staying alive is most paramount to his character in this story. I really didn't think they needed to add anything else. I think it made it a little bit complicated. But what do we all think of the character of Syl? I personally don't mind him. I don't think he really needed to return. The only thing I don't like about his character is the voice modulation. Never like that. Never. I like the idea that Seal does have technology to do a mind transference on his master, and I find that interesting that he could potentially alter how minds think. So maybe it was a good idea to bring him back, because I suppose with the series in such a massive jeopardy, it made sense for them to bring in a familiar face, right? This is clearly something for this series that they think they seem to have needed. One of the things that happens throughout most constantly, the entire story arc has a lot of what I would call stunt casting. So for example, in the previous one, we had Joan Sims. In this one, although I'm not entirely sure how famous he was at the time, we had Christopher Ryan, who played Keeve. I think maybe it was The Young Ones he was known for at the time. And then in the next story, we have Honor Blackman. And in a later story, we see the return of the Master. Plus, we also have Linda Bellingham in the trial scenes, and we also have Michael Jaston. Much like today, clearly back then, we were getting what I would call injected stunt casting. However, back then, it was all done with actors. I will also say that most of these actors who came in are pretty well-known actors. Probably also, these actors wanted to do Doctor Who because no matter how bad the story is, that's an honourable credit to your name. Like, even now it is. One of our other well-known actors in this is Brian Blessed. Oh boy. Brian Blessed, one of my most common notes throughout this entire story is Brian Blessed is so loud. He is, naturally, of course, very well cast as the king. He is loud, he is boisterous, the character, that is, and I think it was a very easy casting decision and a casting choice perhaps for Brian. Yes, he was incredibly loud. I think that Brian is very much suited to the stage because of his loudness. He is a very broad man, so naturally he can project. Naturally, he's one of those actors that doesn't always try to make it smaller for the screen. His performance, though, in this is varied throughout. And yes, it's varied in volume performance as well, but there are times where it's just too loud and the microphone picks up way too much. I think it's part 7, which is the weakest story part. He is very loud, and there's a bit where he shouts and there's an echo and the mic picks that up and it made it even worse. What I do like, though, is that the script takes advantage of that fact and they make a point of saying that he is very loud. So it was all in good jest. Paul Bowler, 5345 says, Marsh Minnows, probably best sums up Mind Warp, squishy, icky, but oddly watchable, if only for Brian Blessed, being wonderfully OTT in every scene. Brian Blessed, if you are looking for a character that needs to be loud without barely even trying, then Brian is your man for that. He's a great actor and he did suit this role extremely well. He's got some of the best bits in it. For example, in part 5, he briefly wakes up and calls Crozier scum and then falls back to sleep in his experiment. I find that really funny, makes me laugh just talking about it. I also like the fact that when he wakes up, he goes stark raving bonkers and destroys the laboratory, and he saves the Doctor. He also has a wonderful scene with Perry. It's a bit of a soapy moment, I would say, but it is a nice scene where she's showing that she is homesick, and he does a really good job in playing that scene and cheering her up for the best that he could do. So I do like that scene. And speaking of Perry, this is Perry's last story. It's a bit shocking that it is her last story, but I think that is because she joined towards the end of the Peter Davison era, and then there was also an 18-month hiatus where she would have been working on the show. I think we would have seen her a bit longer on our screens had they not cancelled the show or put it into a temporary hiatus. But she's really good in the trial of a Time Lord. She's grown the character up a lot. She's not as whiny. They've certainly dressed her down a lot more in this than what they did in her first stories. The bit where she's explaining the planet Earth to the king, oh, you'd like it there. Lots of madmen playing at warriors and actors playing over the top in politics. That's what she said. And that statement, even though it was integrated into the plot naturally because it fitted, the story and who she was talking to, it made me think of actors in today's world. Talking about politics, it was a very well delivered speech from Perry. Nicola Bryant does a fantastic job. She really has come into the character of Perry by this point. I like it when she saves the Doctor in part 7, although I do say that the Doctor should be prioritizing saving her, but in this case, I'll give it to her because it just couldn't be helped. They needed to do that in order to move the plot along. Her ending, though, so her ending with Lord Keeve's mind getting transplanted into hers, I love that. Who else thought that she was really dead? I certainly did. I'm lucky because I get to watch it straight through and find out, well, that she wasn't dead. But people back then would have had to have waited to find out. It is quite a sad circumstances, though. The Time Lords used the king as an assassin. They caught him in a time bubble. And by doing that, that obviously resulted in Perry's demise. And it would prevent Crozier's experiments as well from changing time. Although, I will say this, at the end of the trial of a Time Lord, we find out that Perry's actual ending is her marrying the king and not dying. So I would say then, surely, Crozier's experiments would have come into fruition. I don't think they should have walked that back. Perry should have stayed dead. Ian Buckley, 2347, agrees. A story I only remember for the shocking ending that the production team unfortunately walked back later. Seal is great, but everything else is meh. Granted, though I can tell she really enjoyed doing something different. Very different. I think the companions do enjoy that when they get to do something different and not ask constant questions or be captured. She does get captured in this. She even has to undergo a fake interrogation, which I know she wasn't too keen on filming in real life, but she had to sell it. And who else thought that the Doctor had betrayed Perry? I liked that because it gave Colin a little something different to do, and because his Doctor's more abrupt and more sarcastic, you believe that he's actually portrayed them. It's almost faith destroying in this Doctor. However, that does not happen. Brian Blessed, now think about it, said something about Colin not being sure as to where he wanted to take his Doctor. He also does acknowledge that Colin was dealing with a lot of what was going on behind the scenes. I've got that from information from, I think it was 30 Years in the TARDIS or something like that. It was definitely a documentary I got that from. Now, I'm inclined to disagree. I think he knew exactly what he wanted to do. However, in this story, his Doctor is all over the place with the writing. It has both good and bad points in this story, and I'm always full of praise for Colin. Nearly all the time. There's one thing, though, that I didn't like, and that was his brains being addled. It was very bizarre. It made sense, I guess, in the story, and I'm sure that Colin had a lot of fun doing that, but it didn't convince me entirely. This could be because of lack of time and the external factors that are going on around him at the time. It could also be lack of direction. It's not necessarily his fault. That's the only thing, though. He does save Perry from Dorf. He also saves her from the rack, even though they tried to pin the rack dying on them. Colin delivers a fine performance when telling them that the CD phaser had gone off accidentally. Do you think that his Doctor behaves like the Doctor in this? I've mentioned that he does save Perry, but he also does a double cross. even though it's not a true double cross. But then there's also a bit that I'm not too keen on, and this is to do with the writing, not with Colin, and that's the skedaddle test. And they do that in order to escape. I wasn't too keen on that. However, there is no sonic screwdriver with this incarnation of the Doctor, and there never will be. So that leaves the writer with more room to be creative. It's not the best thing to come up with, but it's better than the sonic screwdriver for sure. I feel very bad for the Doctor though, because the Time Lords intervened when he was trying to save her. And because they did that, he was not able to do the one thing that he really wanted to do, and that was ensure her safety. And I have reason to believe that he would have saved her. They showed that he had not betrayed her, and that he was thinking of her before he was taken out of time. The Doctor's devastation at that moment was a brilliant cliffhanger. I'm not too keen on the courtroom cliffhangers. However, this one was definitely one that was well within reason to do so. His "You killed Perry" line was sublime. The Great Bert 9005 says, "You killed Perry." Colin's delivery of that line, angry, accusative, and forlorn. It finishes with him saying that he was essentially taken out of time for a reason, and he has every intention of finding out what that reason was. It was a sad cliffhanger, and I think I will say that for this story, these are better than the first 4 parts cliffhanger wise for this story. So at the end of part 7, we believe that Perry and the King have been zapped to their demise, and at the end of part 6 you can hear the King Yrcanus saying to the Doctor, "Now it's your turn to die," which is very intriguing because we don't really know what the King is capable of at that point. We can only guess, having seen what he did to the laboratory. And I think my favourite cliffhanger though was at the end of part 5, and that was when the Doctor was being put on the bench to have the truth extracted from his brain. Genius, I honestly think. There are some other great points, just to mention quickly, very quickly. The operation scene on Kiev is pretty good. I find it intriguing that the Doctor did go ahead and help them with this operation. It shows in many respects that he is thinking about mortality, and that it's very different to the aspects of a human. I think Christopher Ryan is a very nice addition to Doctor Who too, and you can tell it's him because of his voice. I also found it really funny, and I think it was when Keeve, Christopher Ryan, wakes up, he thinks that he's dead because he sees Syl and he just goes, "Whoa," and reacts. And I think it works so well because Christopher Ryan obviously has a knack for comedy, having starred in many comedies over the years. It made me chuckle. I just also want to take a moment to say, just imagine a diverse cast with no singing, no dancing about it. What I mean by no singing and dancing is not jazz hands and belting out a few musical numbers that we've had since the last series. What I'm saying is we have actors from different cultures in this story, and we have Nabil Shaban, who has brittle bone disease but is seen as a major pioneer for disability arts, and there's no song and dance about it. These performers are there doing their job, being cast extremely well in their roles, and they are loving it. It's very clear that they enjoy what they do. And how regal does the Inquisitor sound by being called Sagacity? I just thought that I would add that in there because I have some issues now that I would like to address, and it's not to do with the Inquisitor, but I thought it was a good segue. We're going back to calling the Valeyard names. Oh yes. One of the first names we get is Brickyard. I'm not too keen on that. It's a sign of you're losing the argument. Could that have been the sign of Doctor Who losing its way back then? There's still too many cutaways also to the courtroom. However, the costumes look good. The staging for the looks, it looks good. The makeup for Dorf, Kiev, and Sil looks fantastic. I think they could have done with some more money for this. However, I think that a lot of money did go on the special effects. I really did believe that because I love the opening shot of the space station. I like the fact that this is a recurring theme that keeps coming back through the entire story arc. I think JNT committed to that very well. Unfortunately, that does mean that some bits appear to have been neglected. I love the 80s colouring in the opening shots. It's very luminous. It's very fitting for the time. I don't know if it was too much. It's quite a strong colouring. And if they ever return to Thoris Beta, they would have to do that look all over again. And, well, to look at that for a long time, it's very strong on the eyes, but I do like it. And I especially love it when the TARDIS lands in front and you've got the background of Saturn behind it. It's almost like they were trying to push the boundaries of the CSO color separation overlay. So overall, this is an okay story. It's not my favourite one of the bunch. I'd give it 6 out of 10 maybe for The Terror of the Vervoids. It was written by Pip and Jane Baker. It was directed by Chris Clough. And it aired between the 1st of November to the 22nd of November 1986. It averaged viewing figures of 4.88 million people. It's now time for the Doctor to present his own evidence. He has reviewed The Matrix and chosen an event in the future, which he believes is his best defense. Moga 2986. The Doctor receives a distress signal, and he and the new companion Mel answer. They land on Hyperion 3. The signal that they had received, they believed, was from Communication Officer Edwards. He had been attacked, supposedly, by an unseen creature. Whilst they are getting ready to investigate what was going on the freighter, the Doctor and Mel meet Professor Lasky, Bruckner, and Doland. They're all transporting Demeter seeds and large flower pods. Whilst the Doctor and Mel are investigating, they discover a half-human, half-plant who had been strapped to a bed. She begs them to stop Lasky. They find out that she was a victim from an experiment she had been working on with them. She had scratched herself, and pollen had penetrated the scratch. They want to reverse the infection, so they are taking her to the planet Earth. The Doctor and Mel discovered that the Vervoids were the creatures that had come out of the pods near where Edwards had been electrocuted. These plants had begun offing humankind on board the Hyperion 3. Bruckner tries to change the course of the Hyperion 3 to head into the black hole of Tartarus. He was trying to do this in order to destroy the Vervoids. However, the Vervoids fill the bridge with gas and Bruckner is unfortunately offed as well. They can direct the ship away from the black hole, but then Rudge and the Morgarians, hijack this ship. Meanwhile, the Doctor has discovered that the Vervoids take lives in order for their own survival. So he has an idea that Vionizium would push the Vervoids towards the end of their life cycle. This idea works, and then the Doctor and Mel leave for the TARDIS. However, this is not good news for the Doctor. In the eyes of the Valeyard, the Doctor has committed genocide, and he wants to seek the end of life termination against the Doctor. So, what do you all think of this story? I know that Pip and Jane Baker are often credited as the worst writers of Doctor Who. Today's Doctor Who is a mess. So, can we officially dethrone them? Can we not do that? This story isn't great. It is the weakest of all four of the stories overall in the story arc of the trial of a Time Lord. However, this was a story that was still very much in the realms of sci-fi. Pip and Jane also like a bit of a whodunit, don't they, really? It kind of did get waylaid, though, a little bit. It had all the elements of sci-fi there. It had a spaceship, it had aliens, it had weird-looking creatures, and I think it's probably their second worst story. I think their worst being The Time and the Rani, but they focused on hitting points, didn't they? All within the world of Doctor Who. It was still very clearly Doctor Who, no matter what people think of the story, especially compared to today's Doctor Who. I must say, in their defense, this can't be an easy thing to do, because this entire story arc is a story within a load of other stories, essentially. So they're primarily writing just the bits that are not happening in the courtroom, but they've got to do it in a way that the script editor, Eric Saywood, can link it together. That's going to create so much communication, so much back and forth, and probably a lot of tension. Not foreshadowing anything, of course, naturally. I hate to think how many rewrites they would have had to have done in order to make this story work. And for a lot of people, this is not their favourite story, is it? Out of all the stories presented in the trial of a Time Lord, this is probably one of the easiest to follow. And I wonder if the reason for that is because there are not so many cutaways to the courtroom. And I prefer it that way. I also think that because of that, it does make it more impactful when it does cut back to the courtroom and the Valeyard goes on a rant and he loses his temper and suggests that the Matrix had been tampered with. And because there were a few cutbacks, it hits you a bit harder. Whereas when they were doing it before, in the other two stories, it's not as impactful when the Doctor suggests that the Matrix is being tampered with. It is really tough, though, because in this case, they have to focus on the story and not the courtroom, because it is a whodunit. And I quite like a bit of a whodunit in Doctor Who. And really, they do need to focus on the storytelling because, well, the Doctor and Mel need to get to the bottom of it. They need to know who sent them the Mayday. They need to know who has passed away. They need to establish all of these facts. And you can't do that if you keep cutting back to the courtroom. And I think this is why, out of all of my notes for the trial of the Time Lord, this is where I probably had the least notes about the courtroom, because I was able to focus on the main story. So props to Pip and Jane for being able to make it like that. Now, I feel like the story is a tad under-rehearsed. I feel like there were observations there that were not observed in some respects. Now, I'm going to talk about Bonnie Langford. So I'll get to this point that I was making in just a moment, but let's talk about Bonnie Langford just quickly. The introduction of Mel, I can see why people found her annoying. I think the one thing that they really did impose on her was the screaming. I sometimes wonder whenever I watch this if that was the reason why she was hired. I'd like to think that she was hired on merit, but boy, this woman can scream. For those of you who do not know, there was this character that she used to play. Oh, for the life of me, I cannot remember the name. But the character used to say, "I shall scream and scream and scream." And she did that when she was a child. She was a child actress, you see. My dad could probably tell me what it was, and he can also pinpoint the Bonnie Langford scream, even today. And it's probably because of that TV program that she was in. And I also mentioned my dad's opinion of Bonnie Langford screaming in the Time and the Rani review. And the scream that Bonnie Langford can do just would scare you within itself. One of the things that they did get right when they brought her back for the new series was they got rid of the screaming altogether, because she is much more mature. She is an older woman now and she can probably still get up there, but thank God it was gone. It was gone. Thank goodness. So they make Mel a computer expert. So I'm going back to the point now that I was making earlier. So why is it then that she is in the gym and the little room off to the side? She's just pressing buttons just randomly. I felt like this was an observation that was missed by perhaps Bonnie or the director, or maybe both of them in this regard. I know that you can argue that this is a computer that she's not seen before, and she's probably a little bit panicked. But I could have thought that she would have been more cautious, especially when this story also implies that Mel at this point had been travelling with the Doctor for a while. I'm not too keen on her introduction either. Making the Doctor work out, was there any real need for this? And the whole business of carrot juice. Like, why? I'm not entirely convinced that Colin believed that either. The look on his face when he was having to do that, and another question, why is everybody working out in this story? That just seems to be all they are doing. So anyway, back to Mel. She also cuts the Doctor off on a regular basis as well. I'm not too keen on that. That said, she is very much a stark contrast to Peri. Peri is very much more of a down-to-earth type of character, a little bit whiny at times, but, she is very well-rounded. Mel, on the other hand, was completely different. She had a lot more smarts than Peri, even though they didn't really seem to write that into her character, her computer smarts anyway. She has a greater thirst for adventure compared to Peri, and I think because of that, for some people, she gets seen as a breath of fresh air. She has some really good bits in this. She's under suspicion for offing people. She gets kidnapped and put into the laundry room ready to be jettisoned, and she energizes the Doctor into investigating. She probably has one of the best cliffhangers in the entire story arc, hands down. Okay, credit Pip and Jane, credit. And by best, I think it's also mostly the effects there, so credit to the effects team as well. So Mel and Edwards are where the plants are. He puts his hand on the fence and gets electrocuted. A lot of explosions go off. Some of the plants start coming to life from their pods after high sensitive light has been brought in and exposes them to it, which of course is what gets the entire plot going, and she lets out this massive scream. TMR 4342 says, my favourite story from the season. There's just something about killer plants, Seas of Doom, Days of Triffids. The only downside to the story is the first cliffhanger. I always mute my TV so my ears don't start bleeding. We disagree, obviously, about the cliffhanger. However, I concur about the last sentiment. I can understand why you would want to do that. At the end of part 10, the cliffhanger is the Doctor and Mel discovering the body of what looks like to be a humanoid plant that had been modified, which of course we discover was the young lady who had scratched herself, and pollen had entered the scratch and started mutating her body. I don't find that particularly scary, to be honest with you, but the makeup is pretty cool for it. And then, of course, we have part 11's cliffhanger. Bruckner is aiming the Hyperion 3 back into the eye of the black hole of Tartarus. And then, of course, the courtroom cliffhanger when the Doctor is being charged with Article 7, which was genocide. The writing for the Doctor, I'm not entirely sure if it was up to par. I think if you look at the writers, Pip and Jane, they had written a lot for the Colin Doctor. And I understand, it's my understanding, that they were very involved in talking to Colin about his Doctor. And once they did make sure that his traits were there and they made him smart. However, I think that perhaps adding things that were a bit sort of, well, very much not something I would associate with his Doctor, resorting to cheap magic tricks in the first part of this story, part 9, with the flowers in order to obtain a passenger list. Also, although I must admit it works better than the sonic screwdriver, so I'll take it. He also does some other sleight of hand tricks that I'm not too keen on. He is also making very bizarre jokes, but I didn't even hear the dinner gong. it just didn't seem very fitting. That was the joke. I didn't understand it. Maybe I'm just not good at understanding jokes recently. I appreciate that he was trying to do something different, but to me, his Doctor isn't supposed to be the goofy buffoon type of Doctor. He is much more like the earlier Doctors, so it didn't seem within his character to be doing it, and it seemed to have disappeared by the time you get to parts 13 and 14. Farsight says, I liked this story. It's definitely one of his best stories, and the Vervoids did scare me at the time. I agree, it's definitely one of his better ones, the weakest, I think, being the twin dilemma. It doesn't mean to say, though, that he was entirely out of character. He really wasn't. To be fair, they made sure to put things that were perfectly within his character into it. For example, I mentioned earlier that Mel gets taken and put out for the laundry. When the Doctor goes to the gym, he goes to the room where the recording was made, and he played back the recording and hears the scream. And I love how he plays it, because he had been looking for Mel, but he didn't make the connection when he entered the room that she was in the laundry basket. So when he hears the scream on the recording, he puts two and two together, and the panic that he has is very clear in his face. And you only hope that he makes it in time to save her when she, is going to be jettisoned. And the relief on his face when he finds her says it all. He didn't want her to go and be pulverized, essentially. They also make a point to keep his observation skills top notch. For example, I really like the bit where the Morgarian had a drink, but he consumed a dangerous drink. The Doctor tries to save him and then discovers that it is Grenville or Hallett, who was an investigator. He ended up staging his own death because he had been recognized. But the good thing is, even though the Doctor discovers that it was him that actually sent out the Mayday and not Edwards, he is able to point out that through the chaos of all of that it was Hallett was the only one who was not using a translator. So therefore, he knew that whoever was under the Morgarian disguise was a human who understood English. Okay. So this brings me to my next point. I know I said this was the easiest story to follow, but that doesn't mean to say that it's not without its convolution. It is slightly convoluted. In a very short space of time, the Doctor, Mel, and the Commodore all suspected different people behind what was going on. And what that does is it leads to a slight confusion. The person who it might have been, the person who was committing these crimes, at first we think it was Lasky, we think then it could be Bruckner, and then eventually we get the reveal that it was Doland. But that's not before it all goes all over the place with theories. I feel like with the story, the whodunit part gets a little bit waylaid, which is why that happens. However, I was fooled by the fact that it was Doland who was the person who had done it. So, well, they got me there. I never figured it out. Carl Taylor 3255 says, an enjoyable, quite fun story with mystery with very Agatha Christie-like twists, which, although it has horror elements with the Vervoids themselves and the infected human, also has humour and lightness in it. It does feel more like a story you can relax with than the previous story, although it does invite you to concentrate in order to try solving the murder mystery. And the fact that they keep having multiple people, even though I like this double cross and take over the ship, probably doesn't help it. However, the one thing that remains consistent is that the Vervoids seem to be the main issue here. I'm not too keen on the costuming for these characters, though. They don't look quite right. They look like a cross between man-eating plants and something else, which I can't say without being demonetized. I don't think the reveal is particularly scary. They didn't have much of a reveal in part 11, though I do really like the fact that the passengers had been taken by them. You don't see it, but you know that it is some type of plant that has been taking them. And whilst they're not remotely what I would deem to be a scary alien for Doctor Who, they serve their purpose to the story, and the effects at the end, after their offing spree of the humans in true grotesque violent Doctor Who style that was so contentious with the day and age, and the reason why they were doing this series in order to save it, the effects for their demise was very reasonable. I think this story benefited from some of the special effects. I've said it already. J&T focused on having some really good shots, which this story still has. It's just a shame in this respects that they, weren't able to design better vervoids. And I must say that I think the resolution, surprisingly for Classic, who was a little bit quick, but it wasn't obvious. The Doctor had a theory and it worked, and I liked that theory, and it proved that he was focusing on the bigger picture. Now, speaking of money, I'm going to throw a wild theory out there. In The Mysterious Planet, we have Joan Sims, who was in movies, in particular the Carry On movies. And then in Mind Warp, we have Brian Blessed, who is very well known on TV. And then in this one, we have Honor Blackman. She's a good addition to the cast, but I'm wondering if some of this money was spent on well-known actors. I know it's definitely a thing of actors really wanting to be in Doctor Who. It is still a thing today. That one credit on their list is something that they always want to have. But for me, I personally don't think I would touch the current series with a barge pole, even though I still really want Doctor Who as a credit on my CV. I don't think this was a particularly difficult role for Honor Blackman, though. I think she just casually walked in, did the role, had fun with it, and then just took the paycheck and said, I've done Doctor Who, which is a very fair thing, and I appreciate the fact that she was in it. It was a nice little different role for Honor Blackman, and it was good to see her really on the screens for Doctor Who. Overall, Terror of the Vervoids is the weakest of all the stories in the Trial of a Time Lord. It's not the worst, but it's not the best. So, let's take a look at parts 13 and 14, the conclusion of the Trial of a Time Lord, The Ultimate Foe. Part 13 was written by Robert Holmes, and part 14 was written by Pip and Jane Baker. The script editor for part 13 was Eric Sayward, and then part 14, I believe, is Jonathan Nathan Turner, and he was uncredited. I may have that wrong. It was directed by Chris Clough. It aired between the 29th of November and the 6th of December 1986 to an approximate average viewing figure of 5 million people, and it was the final story of good old Sixie, Colin Baker. The Ultimate Foe is the fourth and final part of the serial known as The Trial of the Time Lord, and it ties together all the loose ends. The Doctor remains convinced that the Matrix has been tampered with and that the Valeyard's evidence was fake. Glitz and Mel also arrived in the courtroom. The Master is revealed to be in the Matrix. He had wanted Glitz to get the black box because that had the technology secrets from the Matrix, which had been taken. It was then discovered that the Time Lords had involvement in this. They traced the sleepers, moved the planet Earth to where the Doctor had found it in the Mysterious Planet. It's then revealed by the Master that the Valeyard is a manifestation of the Doctor's darker side, somewhere between his 12th and final incarnation, and the High Council had offered the Valeyard the Doctor's remaining regenerations in the exchange for fake evidence showing that the Time Lords really are truly corrupt. The Doctor demands that the trial is brought to a stop, and the Valeyard takes off into the Matrix somewhere. The Doctor follows him with Glitz. There, an absurd amount of events occur in a Victorian setting. No rules apply. It is difficult to decipher what is real and what is not. It is revealed that the Master wants the Doctor to overpower the Valeyard because he believes that he cannot do it himself. The Doctor discovers that Popplewick is the Valeyard, and he finds a machine that is a particle disseminator, which the Valeyard plans to use against the court. The Doctor sabotages this and saves the court. The Master had loaded Glitz's master tape into his TARDIS system, but it is booby-trapped and it paralyzes him and Glitz. It results in the Inquisitor dropping the charges against the Doctor. She also tells him that Peri had survived and was now married to the king, Yrcanus. The Doctor and Mel leave in the TARDIS, and then it is revealed at the end that the Valeyard is now posing as the keeper of the Matrix. So, what do you all think of this part of the story? I will cover the original plan, what I believe was the original plan, for the ending later. But for now, I want to talk about the story as we see it on the screen. This part of the story has its positives, but it has its negatives. I think it is very clear by this point that the Matrix has been tampered with. I do like the fact that they did not hide that at all throughout the entire story. It was implied throughout. And I think it was best to do it that way because there were better reveals to come within the story itself. Like, for example, the fact that the Master is a main instigator in this story. He copied the key to get into the Matrix. The Master is such an ingenious snot. I really do like his character. I just want to talk about the Anthony Ainley Master a minute. I think I have said this before. I think this is one of his most downplayed performances in his entire run as the Master. He is a curious actor when it comes to playing this character. He does varying degrees of the Master. His energy is different in each of his stories, and he changes his energy to match the Doctor that he is against. I think I've said it before. I'm sure I have. I also think that he downplayed it in this one because we do have another villain in this, which was obvious in the form of the Valeyard. The revelation that the Valeyard is the Doctor and is somewhere between his 12th and final regeneration and is the darker version of himself was definitely not a twist that I would have expected. People are theorizing that perhaps the Valeyard will come back in the new series. I hope that he doesn't. Michael Jaston, who plays the Valeyard, who played the Valeyard, was brilliant. I've not really touched on him at all in the review of the Trial of a Time Lord as of yet. I don't know how often he had chance to play a villain, but I think it is very evident that he is enjoying it. He has a very easy voice to listen to. The scene where the Valeyard is appearing all over the place. Now, this is one of the scenes that was replacing the original concept that Robert Holmes had the idea of. And it's not a normal scene that I would associate, in my opinion, with Pip and Jane Baker, no longer the worst writers of Doctor Who. But they rolled with something that was perhaps a little different from their normal style. It's one of the best bits, though, because they have Michael delivering this speech as the Valeyard. And this scene must have taken them a very long time to film because of all of the cuts that they would have had to have done for it. But, he's talking a lot and he's very easy to listen to. He's got your attention very much so. Excuse me. Michael doesn't play the Valeyard either as a scary man. He tries to go with a type of, I don't know, is it vanity? Maybe it's vanity. I feel like he's definitely, and pompous isn't the right word here, arrogant is a better word. He doesn't shout. He doesn't really raise his voice all that much. I sense the danger in him. I think because of that, he is able to carry that scene extremely well. In fact, all of the performances in part 13 and 14 are extremely well-rounded. I prefer Linda's Inquisitor, Linda Bellingham, in these two parts more than any of the other parts. She doesn't really have all that much to do other than like, is that right? Be quiet. Doctor, stop it. That type of thing. So I feel like she serves her purpose here in part 14 really well, especially when the Matrix does its weird altered reality. And I think she really relished the fact that she had to order the doctor's end-of-life termination. Of course, that was fake, but I really believed it at the time when she did that. And I must say that would have been a fantastic cliffhanger if they had just stopped it there. Now, I do agree with this statement, though. Paul Clark, 7664, deeply flawed. Every time there was a chance for drama, we cut back to the court. Very true. I would agree with that. The cliffhanger, though, for 13 is very good. I think they were trying to recreate some of what happened in The Deadly Assassin. I don't know if they achieved it or not. However, they had the Doctor being dragged under by the quicksand hands, and that's pretty cool. I would say that The Matrix, though, isn't scary enough in this story, and I think it runs a risk of being a little bit comical. For example, in the beginning of part 14, where the Doctor is coming back out of the quicksand, to everyone, I'm sure that it was really clever how they did it. It didn't look right. It looked almost laughable. I suppose that's what happens, though, when you change scripts suddenly and you don't know what was supposed to have come before it. Another thing that was predictable was the fact that Popplewick is the Valiard. It's also a trick that is associated with the Master. It's nothing that I would associate with the Valiard or even the Doctor. That's just me. But I suppose that Pip and Jane did do something similar with the Rani. Not all of the stuff in The Matrix is bad. The courtroom inside the courtroom where the Inquisitor orders the termination of the life of the Doctor is really good. And I do think still it would have been a fantastic cliffhanger. I do like the concept of doing a courtroom within the courtroom within a courtroom. That's pretty mind-warping reality and very confusing. Although it probably would have been better set within the historical setting itself. I also like the historical setting in The Matrix. I'll give this the benefit of the doubt. They did try to keep it to very few settings. When we saw The Matrix for the first time, we had lots of different things going on, and I think here they were trying to do a less is more type of thing. Mel is better in this story, however, she does call the Doctor Doc, and obviously I think that was a callback to the first Doctor and the fact that he didn't like it. I don't like it either, It is what it is, though. Thankfully, for the most part, they kept it in the courtroom. They kept Mel in the courtroom. I prefer the fact that Glitz went with the Doctor instead into the Matrix, even though that we find that Glitz is working for the Master. And I really think that he should have gone travelling with the Doctor, actually. I think he would have been a really good companion. Probably a better version of Adric. That was quite a reveal, though, that Glitz had been working for the Master all along and that he was attempting to get the black box for the Master's benefit, which the Master now has. But I think Glitz's reaction to everything is highly amusing in a lovely way, though. And I was surprised that the Doctor's life was saved by the Master, even though it was for the Master's own gain. I suppose Pip and Jane did some good twists and turns in the best way that they possibly could. When they inherited half a story and not knowing what the original ending was supposed to have been, I wonder if they had known what the original ending was meant to have been, if they would have gone for a toned down version of it. But Eric Saward withdrew the rights to the script, so they couldn't do it. Now, I am pleased, if anything, and I don't really want to say it, but I have to, that Colin's Doctor did go out this way. That sounds really cruel, okay? The circumstances behind his firing were unpleasant and unnecessary. However, they tried to finish on a really big story for him. They wrote it with the idea of this may not come back. So they did a big thing. I would have liked him to have come back for Series 24. It was never meant to be. But his performance in this was fantastic. He was at the point where he was really trying to sell it and save it. He had a lot of weight on his shoulders, being the face of the show. And you could really see him trying to get his point across. There's explosions going off around him in one of the scenes. And yes, I know, the money, small explosions, but that takes a lot to stand there stock still in the middle of those explosions and not jump. That would have taken some practice as well, for sure. His reaction was to remain actionless when actually acting is supposed to be reacting. So I was very impressed. That's very difficult to do. I particularly loved the part where the end where he introduces the antiphase into the telemetry unit. I do apologize if I have pronounced that wrong, but he triggers a ray phase which shifts back into the matrix and resolves the entire situation that was going on around them within the courtroom. His urgency in his panic and his willingness to show that he was going to try and save everyone metaphorically and of course as the Doctor in the show was fantastic. And what can I say? I love the Sixth Doctor. The Great Bert 9005 says, thrilling to think that the Matrix, the repository of all Time Lord knowledge past and future, was powered by a megabyte modem. You know, that thought never occurred to me. Colin was too busy selling it as much as he could. He tries to deliver a very coloured performance in this storyline, and I'm very pleased he went out of his way to do so. Unfortunately, his last lines were carrot juice, carrot juice, carrot juice. That's a bit of a lame duck, unfortunately. And it was something that Big Finish decided to rectify, and they did give him a proper regeneration. Listen to that story. I highly recommend it. And that ending, the reveal that the Valeyard is now posing as the keeper of the Matrix. Who would have expected that? I certainly didn't. Even though I've seen the trial of a Time Lord multiple times, I always seem to forget that the Valeyard survives at the end. But Pip and Jane Baker put the seed in, so maybe that one day the Valeyard could return. Sadako24 says, not the most satisfying conclusion, but probably the most fun segment of the whole trial. The Master and Glitz definitely raised it up a notch, and there's a certain haunting poignance to it being a last ride for Robert Holmes's imagination. I think it'd be a better resolution overall if Perry had been sent as witness instead of Mel to properly make it clear the Doctor really was framed by the Matrix. Yes, I understand what you're saying. I think it would have been a good idea if they had Perry and King Yukanus do that, if they had decided that Perry was going to stay alive. However, they did it with Mel, and I feel like that was added in by JNT probably when he was editing the scripts, especially the survival of Perry. Listen, I think Perry should have died, to be honest. So the ultimate foe, even though it's one hot mess behind the scenes, I think overall that they did pretty well for what they had to work with. So I have a fun fact for you. I had not looked up what the original ending for this story was, like, ever. I didn't touch it. I did know that there was an alternate ending, but I tend not to tarnish my memory with what could have been. However, for the reviews, I had to make an exception in this case. I did go and find out what the original ending was supposed to be, and I think I found it, although please do tell me, and I'm sure you will, if I am not correct. So for anyone who doesn't know, Robert Holmes sadly got sick and passed away before the completion of part 14, the story, which was unfortunate because I think the original ending was a million times better than what we got. And in this case, it's not the fault of Robert Holmes, naturally, can't help it, or the Bakers. We all know that there were issues going on behind the scenes with Doctor Who. Now, obviously, no one can help with what happened. However, Eric Saward, he took over the script to finish it off the way that Robert wanted it written. There were disagreements between Eric and JNT happening around this time, and it all resulted with Eric resigning. And JNT also believed that the script was too dark. The BBC was effectively holding Doctor Who to ransom because they believed it to be too violent. Eric withdrew the script, and so JNT commissioned Pip and Jane Baker to write the remainder of part 14 with no knowledge of what the ending was supposed to have been. I think I've got that correct, right? Okay. So almost everything that we see in part 13 is from the mind of Robert Holmes, and in part 14 the story is completely different. Pip and Jane did fine. I would say the overall ending that we got was okay. However, I liked I do think that the original ending would have been much better, because that would have opened so many doors, in my honest opinion, for series 24. The plan was along the lines of the Valeyard holding the Time Lords to ransom and make them give him the Doctor's remaining regenerations. The Master had been offered a pardon in exchange for the Doctor's life. However, he doesn't go through with it. The Doctor would have found a way to get into the Valeyard's TARDIS. The Valeyard would have opened the time vent, and the Doctor and the Valeyard would have been plunged into the time eddy, with the Master then sealing them in. The Master would have saved the universe by doing this, but the Doctor and the Valeyard would have been trapped for eternity. That could have meant one or two things. If the BBC had cancelled the show, then it would have been a very clear-cut ending to the entire show. Or it could have actually led into Colin's regeneration at the start of series 24 and a better tie-in. I think that it would have been a cleaner finish, no matter which way that you look at it, and you could have had the Valeyard as the evil adversary for series 24. The Trial of the Time Lord is a truly epic saga. Whilst it would have been better being steered away from the courtroom, I can appreciate their reasonings behind it. If they were not falling out behind the scenes, then I think that we would have been able to have received a much better production overall. I had a lot of negatives to say about this, but at the same time, I don't think I would change any of those negatives, if that makes any sense. This story does get a really bad rap, but I give it a 7 out of 10. Let me know what you think of The Ultimate Foe and of the Trial of a Time Lord overall. Chat about it, don't shout about it. Like, share, subscribe, and I will be back tomorrow at 4 p.m. Thank you very much for watching. Bye bye.